I don't think anybody would disagree with this, before Hassan Nasrallah's death, he was the leader of the Axis of Resistance. More so than Iran. I mean, Iran was providing the funding and arming, but like as far as the sort of ideological and military leadership, that was really coming from Hezbollah. There's a curse in that as well, because it made them just huge, right? And the bigger you are, the easier you are to track and the easier you are to infiltrate. So I'm just curious if you could speak to that challenge of just being so big.
There's many things to say here. This is very important. First, you're facing obviously the biggest army in the world. You're facing the biggest war technology, the greatest war technology, which is the US, the NATO, the Israelis and all this. And these are like large states everywhere in the world that you're facing. And you're just a bunch of schemers, really. They're sitting in a room. They're very highly intelligent people. I don't know if you've ever seen this interview with the CIA director who was always coming to Beirut in the 80s. There's a bit of an interview on this. There's an interview on him because there was a whole documentary of Imad Moghniye, and he was saying that he's never seen someone so clever in his life that was beating the CIA and the Mossad every step of the way.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Seismic shifts across the Middle East over the last year, from the genocide in Gaza, to the killing of Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah, to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, will reshape the region and force changes in the way resistance operates. Hezbollah especially, which in many ways led the so-called resistance axis, endured dramatic losses while still managing to fend off an Israeli invasion and reoccupation of southern Lebanon. To understand how Hezbollah might evolve after this, it's important to reflect on the group's origins and prior evolution. Why was Hezbollah created in the first place? How did the organization adjust throughout the constant political and security upheavals in Lebanon and across the region? What was its relationship to the left? How has it navigated obstacles like being a non-state actor that participates in a state, and being overstretched as the axis grew larger? Joining me to discuss this and more is Bashir Saade, an interdisciplinary lecturer in politics and religion at the University of Stirling, and author of the book Hizbullah in the Politics of Remembrance. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Bashir, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you on. You have so much expertise on this issue, and so much has happened in such a short amount of time. We've seen, especially with the issue of Hezbollah, we've seen this group change pretty dramatically in just a couple months with this recent massive escalation in Lebanon. And I think, a lot of people are wondering what's going to happen with Hezbollah moving forward. I mean, and we can speculate all day, but we really won't know. Only time will tell. But I think it's important to understand in order to understand how Hezbollah might evolve moving forward, it's really important to reflect on the group's origins and prior evolution, which is something that you've covered in your book. So I know this is a really, really big question, and it's hard to put it in even a sentence or even a paragraph, I should say. But, how would you explain who and what Hezbollah is in layman's terms? And maybe here we can start with the beginning of Hezbollah, and then we can perhaps go from there chronologically.
Okay. So just let's say briefly, Hezbollah is something obviously I think many people know already, and it's been circulating now in most media platform. But Hezbollah is born out of it's very much the product of Israeli occupation of the south of Lebanon. The Israelis invade in 1982. Actually, they invade even before in 76, but in 82. In 82, the big invasion happens. Hezbollah, the Israeli army reaches the Beirut, only to retreat afterwards until Saida region. And this is when the first groups that come to become Hezbollah start operations against Israel. And that succeeds actually in pushing Israel down to the south of the Litani River, the famous south of the Litani River zone. And after that, Hezbollah starts really growing into becoming a fully fledged organization. So that's since 82. It announces itself in 84. And then becomes more of a political party after the 90s or after the Civil War. So yeah, this Hezbollah is very much the product of Israeli occupation of the south of Lebanon. It starts as a militant guerrilla type of organization. It's solely focused on getting Israel out of Lebanese territory, so because it's important to note this, because it has a huge impact on the identity of Hezbollah and also on the identity of other Islamic movements in Lebanon and elsewhere. Hezbollah demarcates itself from a very rich movement of new generation, Islamically minded, let's say, activists and groups. And there's one what becomes Hezbollah is made of people who were mainly just focused on this, whereas you had people focused on Islamizing society, or how to bring about an Islamic state, or how to create what we call the Hala Islamiyya. Obviously, these people were interested in this, but what really made Hezbollah stand out is that sole focus on fighting Israel. Why I say this? Because actually this was also Iranianly sponsored kind of initiative, because other groups went to Iran and said, "Oh, we want to bring Khomeinism into Lebanon, and we want to do this," and the Iranians were not really interested in this. They ended up opting for just that kind of single-minded track of a political Islamic organization that wants to fight Israel, and then the rest of that kind of the whole Hala Islamiyya thing is kind of secondary. So Hezbollah has always been very much based on a military ethos, let's say, and the thing is, it's important to understand this today, because the main thing that has been hit today has been that military infrastructure that we can talk about after.
Yeah. So that's important to recognize. So you're talking guerrilla movement, mostly underground. It has this Iranian idea to it, but first and foremost comes Israel. But then you mentioned in the 90s it becomes more political. Could you explain what you mean by that?
So in the Civil War, Lebanon did not really have a functioning political system. It was a divided region into different kinds of militia that were sponsored also by other groups, by other states, and that situation did not make it necessary for a group to have any kind of political established entity. But then in the 90s was the Ta'if Accord, and this kind of return to some kind of a civil, quote unquote, life, with the Syrian presence and all. Hezbollah was faced with a choice. What happened to the resistance project? In the beginning, it was shaky. The Syrians were against really having some kind of Iranian sponsored group that was doing its thing, without any Syrian
control,
overarching authority over it. But I mean, to cut a long story short, there were negotiations. There was clashes. Actually, people died. And then there was negotiations, and then the Iranians explained to the Syrians that this is not going, and Hezbollah could keep its resistance, but also Hezbollah had to face this choice of staying underground or becoming part of of the political life. We can talk about this later, because this was a blessing and a curse at the same time, as we see it now. The blessing was that Hezbollah attracted allies. It the people in Hezbollah learned to communicate, with other groups, and try to compromise and understand how the system works. It actually came to think, okay, maybe the system can work in certain ways to our advantage, but also it may have all sorts of constraints. So it was a political maturity, and that was spearheaded by Nasrallah. Said Hassan Nasrallah. He was really the one who, and we was Abbas al-Musawi already, but really was Nasrallah. This is what took Hezbollah from this kind of guerrilla movement, underground, and mostly obscure, to someone who had allies everywhere, but also enemies, and having to understand how the system works. In 1992, there was the parliamentary elections. They elected. They were part of the parliament, and after 2005, the assassination of Hariri and the withdrawal of the Syria from Lebanon, they also had. They started taking ministerial positions, which they didn't do before 2005. It's important to understand how much Hezbollah was reluctant to actually, enter that system.
Yeah, and then before we get to 2005, because I think that's an important, sort of new era of Hezbollah, like you mentioned, for the first time they're actually running ministries in government. You have the 2000 liberation. Does that have a dramatic impact on Hezbollah's role in Lebanon and even regionally?
Of course, 2000 was a watershed. It was the first. There were already proofs that the Hezbollah was effective operationally in 1996, for example. But 2000 was really the almost a miracle, of that, the whole south of Lebanon that was thought to be lost, by most commentators. And obviously, imagine to what extent Hezbollah was met with the skepticism of with most Arab people, or Lebanese, but also the rest of the Arab world. Like, who can beat Israel? Who can force Israel to do anything? Like, nobody could ever get Israel to do so, to compromise on anything. That was the first time Israel showed that it could actually relinquish large chunks of land, and just withdraw from it, through the workings of just or the kind of exhaustion that Hezbollah has inflicted on Israeli troops time and time and again over the whole 90s period. So 2000, yeah, was a huge thing, and it obviously made Hezbollah much more of it legitimized the project of Hezbollah, but it also, the problem is there were always haters and lovers of Hezbollah, and the haters kept growing, but also the lovers kept growing. It's like it depends. And so in 2000, the haters, in a sense, were more emboldened by the idea. Okay, so now remove your weapons. We're all it's over.
Yeah.
Israel is out. And Hezbollah is like, no, there's other territories that are occupied. Oh, this is a justification for you to get the weapon, to keep the weapon. No, but there's also a strategic defense positions we should be in. We can't just remove the weapons just because Israel is gone, etc., etc. So there was a whole, these debates have always been there. The ones you were listening to today. It's important to see how, even with Hezbollah showing its strength, its kind of the kind of edge it can have over Israel, it continued to face opposition and clashes.
And then we get to 2005, and that's when they, as you said, the Syrians leave. Hariri is assassinated. Hezbollah is a part of this big parliamentary bloc that includes this allyship with FPM.
Yeah.
And other groups, but that was a big deal, right? That gave them a huge parliamentary bloc, and they enter into ministries, and from then on, it becomes an issue of the political side of Hezbollah growing pretty dramatically, because they have to, right? They're a political party. They're serving their community where they're elected to power. And then also the military side is still doing its thing. Then 2006 happens, and then 2008 happens. I mean, God, so much happened, and we could do a
Yeah.
whole just like episode on just like that. But I guess to shorten it, like what would you consider this era? Let's say 2005 to, oh God, so much happened. So like 2005 to maybe before the Syrian civil war started.
Yeah, 2011 is
Yeah.
Syrian, the start of the Syrian events. No, it's huge. I mean, the thing is, if somebody looks historically at what's been happening, even since the 80s, I mean, obviously since the 20th century, but if you want to go back,
Mhm.
but Lebanon has always been a highly unstable zone where external parties are at it through internal divisions. I mean, this was the equation of the civil war. So in the 90s, we thought the civil war was over, but most of the way politics was done through the civil war mindset just continued in the 90s and continued in the 2000s. It's the same thing. It's the tit for tat between different groups, parties, not only sects, actually groups, parties, different national visions. You know, some people's Lebanon is that one country that had diametrically opposed national visions. You don't have this. It's like in France during the World War II, you had the Vichy government, and then you had the resistance against the Vichy government and the Nazis. In Lebanon, we have both existing, and nobody's
Me too.
you know, it's either you are, you know, some people are okay with even signing peace with Israel. Others are thinking Israel is the biggest problem we have in the region. How do you actually bring these people in a parliament to discuss things? A parliament is made. So in a country like the UK, you know, France, all the so-called first world, you know, countries, this national paradigm is already settled. We all agree on the broad lines, and then we can discuss things in the parliament. We don't have this. We have a situation where there is zero agreement on what is the national visions. And then Hezbollah tried after 2005, I'll go back to 2005, but Hezbollah tried to say, this is our national visions, and this is what we think is the priority for Lebanon. Now, of course, some people may disagree, you know, and maybe rightly so. But you can't bring together somebody who thinks Israel is not a really an issue, and somebody who thinks Israel is the quintessential issue of regional stability in the region. And so in that kind of frame, we have to understand why Lebanon has never rested. I mean, as a region, 2005, the assassination of Hariri is really because of these clashes. It was a clash over, you know, the role of Syria and Lebanon, which has to do with, again, a regional situation. The role of the resistance project also. I mean, the first thing that followed the aftermath of the killing of Rafi al-Hariri was, what do we do with the resistance? And you know, there was if you think 2005, 2006, this is when the Israeli attack. It's not even it's a year. It's nothing. 1 year only passed between this dramatic event, the withdrawal of the Syrian army, which is another dramatic event. I mean, the whole thing, and then there were a lot of clashes. You remember there was this the Islamists. There were a few bombing attacks from Islamists, and you know, there was a whole Al Qaeda thing going on. Probably the people like Jolani were involved in this, you know, that we have today. So all of this is happening. Highly insecure environment, highly unstable. 2006 happens because again, Hezbollah is trying to carve a legitimacy for its project. It's saying this is the issue. The issue is here, and yeah, so it never rested. After 2006, they also went out against, even after the whole war, there was the whole plan of dismantling the telecommunication channel of Hezbollah. Obviously, Hezbollah defensively retaliated, and then 2008 they go into Beirut and dismantle the various militia groups of various militia element of the Mustaqbal Party. It never ended. And then right after this, the Arab uprising started, which is a huge watershed also in the region. Suddenly, the whole region was unstable. And we know the story. I mean, 2011, Syria, then Hezbollah has to figure out, should we go into Syria or not, which is a huge deal. Yeah.
And then 2011, I mean, Syria isn't just about Syria. Lebanon is like a coast surrounded by mostly Syria, and then
Yeah.
Historic Palestine, Israel. So you have this this uprising in Syria. It's very quickly militarized on really all sides. The U.S., everybody's trying to get its peace in Syria. And it becomes very unstable. You have the rise of Al Qaeda, ISIS. This becomes a danger to the entire region. Hezbollah does officially get involved in like 2013.
Mm-hmm.
As well as the Iranians and then eventually the Russians. The Americans and the Gulf states have already been involved. You have people
Mm-hmm.
like Jolani or what's his name? Ahmed El Sharrah or something, which I guess is his new
Shara,
Al
Shara,
Sharrah.
yeah.
I don't know. Either way, that's it. So Ahmed slash Mohammed Al Jalani. It is. I mean, it's really incredible. This guy's entire record has been completely like whitewashed because he did play a role leading a group that carried out horrific violence, not just in Syria but also in Iraq and in Lebanon. But all that's to say, I mean, this has a huge impact on Hezbollah because it becomes an involved party
Mm-hmm.
for various reasons, whether to protect its ability to have, a land bridge for weapons, as well as the territorial integrity of Lebanon, right? Because these groups are coming to invade and plant car bombs in Lebanon, and they want part of their caliphate to be in Lebanon, and on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you want to add anything about that, you can. I'm just kind of bringing us through the events that impact Lebanon and impact Hezbollah. And then that kind of dies down. The Syrian war becomes a frozen conflict for a period of time, I think starting in about 2019, when the government took back a significant portion of its territory, though at this point, Syria is kind of like split into different zones. You've Idlib backed by the Turks. You have
Mm-hmm.
the SDF backed by the US in the Northeast. And then you've got the Syrian government in charge of, some of the major cities. But at that point, it's frozen. And then comes 2019, where there's an uprising in Lebanon that has a lot of genuine grievances to it because Lebanon's a messed up place. But it very quickly becomes politicized. And then Hezbollah becomes the sort of anti-uprising party that's sort of blamed for everything by those who've politicized the uprising. And it's just a mess there. And I guess I say all this to say, this is kind of what I want to ask you about, not necessarily to go too much into all the historical context I just gave, but I think this is where it becomes a challenge for Hezbollah, where
Mm-hmm.
on the one hand, it is this non-state actor whose primary reason for existing is to defend against and fight Israel and therefore American imperialism. And while also being a part of this state and this region that's having like massive like seismic shifts constantly. So I guess, can you talk a bit about that type of war for Hezbollah, being the non-state actor that's also part of the state?
Yeah, this is a very important point. So when we look at Hezbollah and we look at the region, we imagine these things called Lebanon, Syria, and all to be just functioning states, or at least that they should be functioning states, or they ought to be functioning states. And then we're like all upset. Oh, why aren't they functioning? Let's make them functioning. But it actually, in reality, politics doesn't work this way. It's we've inherited of something, and we were talking about this the other day. We've inherited of something quite messed up, really, from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the presence of British and French occupation here, and then how they carved up the region. And the thing is, but this has a bearing on how Hezbollah behaves, even up to, say, the uprisings that happen in Lebanon, because the way Hezbollah sees things is through all this security lens. These security lens. Of course, a lot of people say, well, if you're going to keep us hostage with the question of security, then we'll never be able to do anything. And it's true, because they say, oh, now it's too unsecure, we can't do much reforms, so stay put and let's wait. And that's the dilemma, and that's the curse, really, that these organizations are asked to act like supermens, in a sense, or to even show some kind of, or maybe they can, if some kind of political virtuoso skills, that they could actually navigate both. They could keep that security question working, and at the same time make sure there's all sorts of internal changes for people to be to have more dignified lives, really. And that was the grievance of the uprisings after 2000 and what would we say, 18, maybe 19. But the thing is, Hezbollah they have their limits, and they've made mistakes, and they haven't stopped making mistakes, because the thing is, again, they're a military organization. It's like asking, we forget this, because we've been so enamored with Nasrallah's presence on screen and the whole intellectual, if you want, uh, environment around what it represents in terms of slogans and things. But at the end of the day, they think like military people. They think like in terms of of the kind of military questions they had in mind. And I think this is sometimes something that they could never really completely break out of. And so, these events, I think, were difficult. On one hand, Hezbollah needs to be part of the system in order to grow and become some kind of political party, and maybe, who knows, maybe statesmen, maybe something like this. Even I remember after 2008, people were saying Hezbollah should have taken over the state when they pushed, but the thing is, that would be the biggest phobia of Hezbollah. Everybody says Hezbollah wants to take over the state. They don't, because they wouldn't know what to do with it, or it would paralyze the kind of other works they do, in a sense. So what happens is that they're faced with this problem, which is, I want to be part of the system, but the system it's like me giving you a really deficient car, and you just want to make it work, and so you're just trying to drive the car, but the problem is the car, it's not you. So the problem is Lebanon, it's not just Hezbollah. You know what I mean? The problem
Yeah.
is the way these states function. They've been struggling with building alliances, fighting enemies, creating security situations here and there, and it never worked. So once they faced with a moment of reforming and stuff, they get scared and paranoid.
Yeah.
Not that it's a good thing. It's that's maybe a mistake. They could have maybe done something at that level, while being brave enough to do something at that level, while keeping that security question done. I don't know how it could have happened. I'm not in the shoes of Nasrallah and others, but that's the kind of dilemmas they're constantly facing. Just like also dealing with the Syrian opposition and intervening in Syria and all that.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I think that this speaks to like probably a problem that third world liberation struggles are constantly running into,
mm,
right? Which is the idea like you're fighting the struggle, but also how do you also have a vision for the future while fighting that struggle? And then you add on top of that the fact that Hezbollah is operating in an environment, and this is not to excuse any mistakes, but operating in an environment that has this confessional system where they're kind of, it's like the way to galvanize people in South Lebanon is how, in this moment in time, when all this happened,
mhm,
is like through Shia resistance, right? So that also limits
mm,
you um, in many ways and puts you in a box and how you have to deal with the Lebanese system. And I don't know how to fix that. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's definitely a huge obstacle. And I kind of want to, before we kind of shift into some other things, or maybe even talk about what happened after October 7th and what that
mhm,
means for a group like Hezbollah, or even what happened in the last few months. I want to ask you about something that I think is a really interesting topic of conversation, especially to have now, and that is the issue of Hezbollah versus the left. And I'm asking you this, as a leftist myself, and most of our audience on this show are leftists, mostly based in North America. And I'm sorry if I'm invisibilizing those who aren't in North America, but I think most of you are. Um, but that said, I think there's this common narrative that I know that you've heard as well, which is that Hezbollah like viciously attacked the left in the 80s and just stole its base of support. And there was a fight between Hezbollah and the communists. That's
mm,
not,
mhm, mhm, yeah.
untrue. But that's a bit of a simplistic way to put it. But I'm asking you about this because you have this whole chapter in your book called The Debt to the Left and the Enemy, the Politics of Resistance. And so I'm curious if you could maybe explain to our audience, what has Hezbollah's relationship been to the left? And maybe that's changed over time, by the way. So you can also add in that if you want to.
Mhm.
Um, and how do they view the left? And what do you mean when you talk about this debt to the left, but then you also add in the enemy?
Mm. Yeah. So So the way I structured this in the book is that I also had a chapter on the Christians and how they
Right.
view the Christians, but also the other sects, and I differentiate between those that have some kind of religious tradition and those who seemingly reject a religious tradition. If you know, so as in the Arab world, as you know, if you were leftist, partly also you were a secularist. Not
Yeah.
everybody, but there's this. And that's actually not completely true because you had people who were religious and who were leftists. Actually, the first people who used Ashura as a place to do demonstrations and things were leftists, were the Communist Party in Iraq and in Lebanon. It was actually done by them, and they're the ones. That's where I say the debt. And there's a debt in the sense that it's the left that created this kind of fight injustice kind of discourse, because the prior position of the Shia the Shia party, the Shia parties, or let's say Shia movement, was quietist. It was used to this idea that we don't want to be part of power, because power was at the time supposedly Sunni, kind of controlled in the whole region of the Middle East and the Muslim world in general. So the Shia were more sitting on the fringe of that, getting their own independence, getting their own endowments and all that, and as a result keeping away from power. Actually, this was one of the main issues between Khomeini and the rest of the Shia clergy at the time, that the Iranians were against the idea that the clerics should be involved in the revolution. And Khomeini was one of the first, and there's obviously some precedence to that in Iraq also, to say, no, we as clergy, we should be in power. And I think one of the things that the left did was exactly that, to bring that discourse in. So the Shia clerics, like Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr in Iraq and others, who Nasrallah and others studied with him, by the way, when they went to Iraq, were very much infused with communist ideas. The Communist Party, let's not forget, in Iraq was at some point in power very briefly. They were so strong, they were so popular. So communism was threatening to take over the Iraq, at least. And the Shia clerics have developed a whole reflection on this and a critique of communism in incorporating the leftist discourse into a more Shia, minded Islamic, or even just Islamic. There was no really Shia Sunni at the time. It wasn't that much of an issue. Minded kind of discourse. So that was part of the debt. The other thing is, but at the same time, in the 80s, early 80s, the main resistance on the ground that was fighting Israel was either leftists or secular nationalists kind of groups, the Palestinian organizations, all of these organizations. Hezbollah demarcated themselves from these groups as al-mu'minun. And if you look at the literature of the time, this is how they identified themselves. Like, we are believers. So there was the believer resistance and there was the non-believer resistance. Obviously, it's the way the Islamically minded people looked at it. Of course, you can say the left also are believers. It's just it's a different kind of situation. But one of the ways Hezbollah galvanized, if you want, its mobilization, it was to say that we have the same slogans as the left. The only edge we put to it is we just bring God back into the equation. We bring al-akhirah, or the afterlife, into the equation. We bring the Husseini kind of slogans in. Of course, it's a bit cheeky because the left did that also in a way, because there were, as I said, religiously minded left. But in Lebanon at the time, the left was highly modernist, highly secular, highly anti-religious. So the clash was really about who was on the ground at the time, what kind of discourse of progress was really pushing through. So this, if you look at the writing in the 80s and the 70s, you can get a sense of these debates. This is how things were polarized, ideologically at least.
Yeah.
So the left, in a sense, taught Hezbollah, that's the debt. It taught how to fight global injustice. It taught the idea that we can fight the Israelis, we can organize and do things on the ground. Even though in the 80s, the left was, as much as the left wants to say otherwise, was getting weaker, more corrupt, less funded. Obviously, unfortunately, the Soviet Union was battling on its own. The Palestinian organizations themselves was way more dismantled and destructured and even fighting each other at some point. And so it was a completely different situation. So Hezbollah emerges as this very strong force that is united, that has the same ideology, and that is willing to face this stuff.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer-supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us. That's a very important, I think, it's an important part of history to understand, because I think when we talk about the left, and this is more me just like pontificating now about the way the left in this region has functioned, is, when you do look at other places in the world, I mean, the left does have to adjust to its region. And so you mentioned, the left in Lebanon during the Soviet times. Like, I think there's, from what I understand, there was this very almost anti-religious aspect to it, despite what you mentioned. But then you look at some, I guess, of the left that exists today in other parts of the third world. I take Latin America, for example, where if you look at a place like Venezuela, it's not anti-Catholic. It kind of infuses that. The Bolivarian Revolution did, at least. It kind of infuses that in the way it speaks to people's identities. And so I think that's something the left in this region might have to contend with, though it's very weak and small. So I'm not even really sure what I'm talking about when I say the left here. But all that's to say, I want to kind of ask you about this before I move on to more Hezbollah specific questions. And that's just your thoughts, generally speaking, about the idea of Islam in politics in general. Because I think for the last, 40 years or so, it has been Islamic movements at the forefront of armed resistance, whether we're talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon, or like a group like Hamas in Gaza, or Iran, which has been, at the forefront of the entire, so-called resistance axis. Whether that exists anymore now or not is a different conversation. But for the last 40 years, it has been at the helm of that, and that being the Islamic Republic of Iran, and having, Islamic principles really driving some of that, or at least, from the way they sort of made that into not the quietest version of it. But with what's happened in the last few months, I guess there is a conversation I'm hearing more people having, and I don't know if you're hearing it as well, about what it means about the future of Islamic resistance and the potential for having like a rise of secular leftist resistance politics in the region. And, I recognize that on my part, that might be some wishful thinking, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that. I know I just said a bunch of stuff, but if there's anything there you want to jump in on.
It's a very important. I mean, it's a very complex question. How much we can. I mean, things change so fast in the region that I wouldn't be able to think. If any form of genuine, or viable leftist politics could emerge, like we had in the early or mid 20s, mid 20th century, but we can at least understand why it faltered and why Islamic movements are really so strong now, or at least stronger. But they're also changing. It's very important to understand that Islamic politics is in complete flow. It's just, it completely changes from one decade to the other. But I think the main thing is that Islamic politics emerges, from my reading, it has to do with to what extent the left espoused a colonialist discourse. I think I see it through the colonial lens, or what we call the post-colonial lens, which is that I think the left very much espoused these notions that there's something wrong with our societies and we need to progress the way that Europeans did, and so we need to to put down like a, it's like a blueprint of how other countries in Europe has done it, and we need to do this like this in our regions. What let's call it the global South or the third world. And so I'm not just talking about the Arab world. And then there were so many different experiences. Latin America and different places in Latin America did it differently. The African continent also, South Asia and all that, where there were leftist, obviously, groups becoming strong. And the Arab world also did it differently. And I think the left that usually grew into something more organic were the ones who could adapt to indigenous, or what we call, local traditions. And by tradition, I mean something very loose. It can mean religion, it can mean like social habits, the environment, the ecology, whatever. To what extent the left became something, organic to this, is the key question. And I think in the Arab world per se, the left placed itself in many instances as something a bit against religion or against, and it espoused because it espoused the kind of Orientalist understanding of Islam being backward or Islam needing reforms and all that. But you know this also is important because actually Islamic movements even espoused that kind of discourse a little bit. They actually took that discourse, but instead they became a kind of a Islam pride, like it's the opposite. So they took this. We need to change a few things maybe, but we're not going to just throw everything away. Or there's something in Islam, whatever that means, by the way, because it's reinvented and reimagined, that is worthy of keeping, and it's making our life or our quality of life better and more dignified. And Hezbollah is a great example of this. I mean, Hezbollah took something about or read the Islamic traditions through the lens of resistance, through the lens of fighting global justice, through the lens of believing means standing for your own rights and dignity and all that. So the narrative was taken and something else was done with it, in a sense. It's rather than just thrown away. So it's a way of structuring life, society, and thinking about our place on the planet and community and all this, that is slightly different from the leftist discourse in that case, in that sense, at least from the Islamically minded person. And that just gained traction because the thing is, Islam is very old. I mean, there's so much you can build on. You have texts, you have traditions, you have habits of life, prayer, fasting, all that stuff, So all of this became galvanizing. You could do so much with it. Whereas the left just had Karl Marx, and Leninist organization. And, okay, what do we do with the rest? How do we marry? How do we live? How do we eat? I mean, Islam just goes into every other details of life. Suddenly it's just a repository for living a certain life that is, more dignified. It's I think that's one of the things that happened. Also, the other thing is, I think Islam is closer to the kind of more conservative. I mean, the other drawback is the whole conservative trend in the world has to do with the fact that capitalism, as that obviously you guys are leftists, so what all the ills of capitalism. One of the things that capitalism does is it unsettles everything. It just destructures everything. It destroys societies. It moves people around, destroys family. Like it just dismantles everything to the down to becoming this individual that consumes and produces, and that's it. That is either a slave to wage labor or that consumes. So that persona that the left has very well analyzed and brought forth that this is a key issue. Islam had an answer to this. To think that it had an answer to this. Well, first let's protect community, and to what extent the left was able to do so sometimes was, it was a more of a, I think, it had mixed results in different parts of the world, especially in the Arab world.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because also like in a place like Lebanon, for example, which is such like a libertarian paradise, I would almost call it.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, yeah. Despite that, you still have a sense of community because of local tradition,
Mhm.
and geography, and just the way people like the village aspect of Lebanon, where you still, see that being like the security net, the safety net, that's like a natural safety net for people
Yeah.
that you wouldn't see in like the capitalist West, for example. So that's a lot of important stuff to reflect on moving forward. But back to the issue of Hezbollah, um, and kind of, building off of that, I think, you know, one thing is when we talk about Iran, for example, since the 70s, there's been, and you and I were talking about this, so I'm kind of taking this from somewhat what you said, but there's been no state project in the Arab world that's really been capable of defying Israel. And
Mhm.
so, in many ways, without Iranian funding, you could make the argument that Lebanon would have already normalized with Israel because it wouldn't have had a resistance, that the occupation and perhaps annexation of Lebanon would have been completed. Um, and so I'm curious if you'd agree with that. And in that sense, how do you see Iran's role with regard to resistance over these last 40 years? And do you think that more might change? Because yes, Hezbollah is a local organization of Lebanese people in the south that, with or without Iran, would have fought occupation because that's what people do. But could it have been successful without the funding and arming is a different question.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a good point, but also we cannot know how it would have happened otherwise. The thing is, when an actor emerges as a strong actor, it monopolizes a little bit what's going on. We have to admit it. I mean, Iran emerged as the patron, as the patron of this, as the godfather, if you want, of resistance, and then it kind of also crowded out the possibility of other patrons, because it polarizes politics. The others are sitting on the fence. So the Gulf countries have become were anyway anti-Iranian, so it puts the rest of the Arab world opposed to this. Where if there was no Iranian revolution, if there was no Khomeinism, and we wouldn't know what would have happened. Maybe the resistance would have found other, things would have organized differently. But that's wishful thinking. This is how history has given us the Iranian Revolution. The Iranians posed themselves as this, and definitely without that, you know. Or at least now we can feel the difference. So if you see now, if there's a change in the status quo of how what things are going to emerge in Syria, then we would understand how, you know uh, regional sponsorship of certain agendas change. So we don't know, we wouldn't know how it would have happened, but definitely Iran has tremendously changed the landscape of resistance in the region. It is the one that, yeah, it's the one that actually sponsored Hamas and Hezbollah over all these years. Even when Hamas tried to go to the Gulf to distance itself from Iran, it came back running to ask Iran for help. And the only way another form of Islamically minded, um, sorry, I'm just finishing this idea. The only way another form of Islamically minded group can emerge, like the HTS now or others, if it wants to distance itself from them, it also has to not put Israel as a priority. It's like the binary is so strong. I mean, I don't know in 15 years what's going to happen, but definitely in the short term, I would very much, I would very much be completely, unset, startled if they would start emerging with an anti-Israeli discourse. It's just not. It cannot happen, because that's the reasons why they're in power. It's because these
Yeah.
were the red lines. So yeah. So in that sense, yeah, Iran was the inevitable, and the loss of Iran in that would be a huge loss. I'm not saying that we've lost them, by the way. I don't agree with that. Some people say that, but it, yeah.
It stands to be seen. I mean, only time will tell how things will move forward. But there definitely does seem to be like a conversation or bizarre debate happening right now about should Iran have armed Palestinian resistance or not. And I'm just kind of like, I mean, if
Oh
they
yeah.
hadn't, who would have? Yeah. Well, if they hadn't, who would have? Like, what are Palestinians supposed to say? No, thank you. Like when no one else is standing up to give them anything to help them.
But
Um,
also, it's important that to know that it's the Palestinians who went to Iran. It's not Iran that goes to the Palestinians. It's the Palestinians who
right.
went and had to prove to Iran that they can do it. Because many people went to Iran, and even Yasser Arafat went to Iran. You know, when Khomeini took over and everything, and but Yasser Arafat came back with empty hands. So I mean, the Iranians decided who to give to, also who would do, who, how the job would get done and stuff. You have to prove yourself, I think, in a sense that you have a serious project and what you're going to do, and all that. It's a bit like, when you apply for funding
Shark Tank.
for a project. What?
It's a bit like Shark Tank.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Or when it's like a job, you go and you do an application. It's a bit like that in a sense. So yeah.
Here's my present. Here's my PowerPoint.
Yeah, here's my
Well,
PowerPoint. Exactly.
yeah.
I'm pretty sure. Oh my God, his name escapes me now. How can Siwat,
Who?
uh,
Sinwar?
Sinwar, he must have gone with a little PowerPoint presentation
I imagine so. I
on a
imagine
pen
so.
on a Pentium 1, or something like this, in that clunky laptop.
Yeah, with
Yeah.
one of those like red lights, like laser lights that you like click at the
Yeah, no, I,
screen.
I don't even think he had that kind of technology. It's too techy for him.
So I think this also brings us to another thing that you and I were discussing before, and that's the issue of being too big. And I've heard people make this because when we talk about mistakes, one of the problems of the whole resistance axis, you could kind of say in some respect, but specifically with regard to like Hezbollah and Iran's relationship, because they worked so closely. And you could even say that, I don't think anybody would disagree with this. Before Hassan Nasrallah's death, he was the leader of the axis of resistance. More so than Iran. I mean, Iran was providing the
Mhm,
funding and arming, but like
mhm,
as far
mhm,
as the sort of ideological and military leadership, that was really coming from Hezbollah.
mhm.
Um, but at the same time, when it became this regional phenomenon, and I'm also curious when you think Hezbollah became a regional phenomenon, but when it did become this regional phenomenon of the leader of this axis of resistance, it's like on there's a curse in that as well because it made them just
Mhm.
huge, right?
Mhm.
And the bigger you are, the easier you are to track and the easier you are to infiltrate. So I'm just curious if you could speak to that challenge of just being so big.
There's many things to say here. This is very important. First, to understand that Iran is not just one voice. Like there's a state, and then that's it, and then Iran controls Hezbollah. All of this. Of course, we can dismantle this. It's not how it works. But the thing is, it's not just Nasrallah. It's Nasrallah, Soleimani, Ahmad Mughniye. These people were a team, right? And that's why Israelis went after them. They went exactly after these people, not nobody else, the Americans and the Israelis. These were the tête pensante, we say, in French, the thinking, the brain of everything, and they were taking the decisions, or they actually were consulted for decisions. I will tell you a story I know from someone that it was narrated to me, so I don't know, but somebody close to or was present in a meeting where Nasrallah was there, and he was in some kind of a meeting, and then he gets a phone call.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.